I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. We'll be talking today about data, and not a drop of discovery. So if you'd all please come up. So if I could ask you to each introduce yourselves briefly, tell us what you do.
So my name is Paul Sonderegger. I'm a big data strategist at Oracle, which is fun because you can pronounce it big data strategist or big data strategist, either way. I mainly work on stitching together our various different big data offerings to solve new problems and helping our customers understand what kind of value that can create for them.
Okay. Sanjeev?
Hi, my name is Sanjeev and I work for Wipro. For those who may not be aware of Wipro, it's a large SI company providing services globally. And one of the large business units within Wipro is called Analytics and Information Management. I look after that business, and obviously big data is a very happening component within that business unit. Essentially what we do is we work with our customers across industries in identifying key areas or key processes within those industries where big data can be leveraged to generate value for those respective processes.
Great, thank you. Paul?
Hi there, I'm Paul Bernard. I'm the Vice President of Market Development for INRIX. For those of you not familiar, INRIX is a company that offers traffic as a data service across a number of industry verticals: automotive, public sector, enterprise, and consumer. And my charter is really to help build out an ecosystem in the Bay Area for the company as data becomes not just a service for the automotive space, but a service that can mash up with a number of internet platforms. I used to work at Nokia in the maps and navigation business, now called HERE. So I bring a bit of a location-based services background to the mission. And INRIX is really a true big data company that's actually built a business, a vertical business, if you will, around data. We've got a full stack from data aggregation to platform, web service APIs, and then applications on top.
Great, thank you. Well, we've all been told that big data has this promise of transforming business, and I wondered if you could talk about some exciting transformations that you've seen that have occurred because of big data. And maybe, Paul, you could start.
Sure. One of the most exciting transformations we saw was with Toyota. So as many of you may recall, in 2010, Toyota had the largest product recall in its history. And here was a brand that is built on quality, which was actually called before Congress to testify about whether their cars had unintended acceleration. You know, you're sitting there in the car and all of a sudden thing takes off through the back of the garage. And so this is a problem, obviously, but Toyota's real problem was that they did not know if there was anything wrong with the electronics of the vehicles. So they knew they were being accused. They didn't know if there actually was a real problem with the vehicles, with the electronics. Could be something else. And so, you know, they're a big user of business intelligence and reports and things like that. But there is no report for show me all the cars that have this problem we never thought would happen. There's no such thing. So what do? And well, what you do is you need to explore. You need to discover not only what things the data can tell you, but really what new questions you should be asking about it. And so we helped them bring together data out of data warehouse and from various different testing and QA applications on the manufacturing floor, but also warranty claims and complaints that were filed with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So big variety of data, totally diverse stuff. And the real key, so that that's great. Okay, so you get this big variety together, and you don't build a model first because you don't know what questions you should ask of it. You need a different approach to that, this data-first approach. But the next thing that happened was really important. We put this in the hands of the warranty engineers. So these are people who are highly trained professionals. They understand what goes wrong with vehicles. They understand how they're manufactured. They understand how they might be remediated. But they can't write SQL. They don't know how to write. They don't know how to express their ideas, their questions as SQL statements. And so we gave them a way for these people to explore the data directly, to even discover new questions they should ask about it. And in the end, Toyota was exonerated. The Transportation Secretary said that there is no evidence for acceleration-based issues in Toyota, period.
So has that changed how Toyota's running its business now, or how are they using this to change who they are?
Yes, so without going into too much detail, they have realized that this is a capability they don't need just once, that they would prefer not to be caught on the back foot again. But they have realized through this experience that while it's extremely valuable to have a structured way of viewing your business and to report on that structured view of your business, it is essential to take completely new perspectives, completely new questions on how the performance of the vehicle may work together with social media that's talking about those vehicles that may be related to issues, customer service issues that are documented at the dealer level. It's essential to have the ability to change your perspective about your business instantaneously as soon as you discover what it ought to be.
Yeah. So staying on the subject of cars, your whole industry has been invented because of big data. But how did you, I guess, how is that created?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, maybe the way to start is to think about location-based services and how they're consumed. So before traffic, probably the best example of business value that's been created around location-based services, notwithstanding all the social media examples like Foursquare, is really navigation. So in-car navigation became a value proposition and an industry was built around it. But for the consumer, it was really just a once or twice a month use case. And the traffic industry has really enabled value for the consumer and the automotive industry in a daily use case context. And what I mean by that is people don't, most of the time when you're driving, you know where you're going. So you don't need to use your Navi system. But you're probably interested on a daily basis in the traffic conditions. And so being able to have traffic as a service integrated into the vehicle's infotainment system enables you to use it every day and allows innovation to happen in terms of how it's delivered as a service. So being able to get drive times is, for example, a product that we offer. And how that's really done, is really a success story to big data. We aggregate data across multiple different sources, so commercial fleet data, data from the automotive installations, from various different public sources. And we normalize it, we aggregate it, and we make it available as a web service to multiple different industries with different service models for each industry. And then we build apps on top of that ourselves, as well as enable channel partners. Like in the case of the fleet space, we work with folks that build fleet management systems and enable them by supporting them with our APIs. So it's really a way of thinking about a web services architecture and ecosystem building around our platform.
Sanjeev, do you have a story of business reinvention because of big data?
Sure, and I would probably share two stories, reflecting...
Might have to keep you to one.
Right. Reflecting, different aspects of it. In the morning, there were a lot of discussions on, this whole voluminous data which is available out there on the internet, the social data, the machine-generated data. The example which I'll give is something where data is available within the organization. You don't have to reach out far. The complexities involved is probably much more contained as far as a lot of these issues around privacy, et cetera, is concerned. So this was for a high-tech manufacturer, and it's a fairly large high-tech manufacturer. Many of us will have their products with us. They run a call center for servicing, for customer service, complaints and services. And typically the way they measured the call center, or what used to happen in the call center, is you get a call, and I'll take an example. If a call comes in where the person says, my daughter has got a laptop and I want to transfer my software and some antivirus software into that new machine, right? Conventionally, the way it used to be handled is somebody will help, assist, close the call, take some statistics down in terms of customer satisfaction, 10 minutes to close the call, no repeat, etc. Those were the KPIs with that. But one of the use cases around big data they put it was to augment that, to include insights from that call. For example, in this specific call, while the call was handled properly, what did you miss out? You missed out the fact that this is probably a middle income group because somebody is trying to optimize the software. There is a college-going person. There are 2 laptops in the house. Right? These are all information which probably has got missed out or not got recorded. And what they did was to translate these calls, audio calls, into a format where these kind of information were extracted and passed on to the salespeople. Now you can imagine if a salesperson gets a list of a target customer which says this is the profile of the customer, these are the opportunities, it's very quick for him to make something which is very, very targeted and very relevant to that household. Just to give you the statistics, post this initiative rollout, the total spend, the total revenue which they got out of the leads generated from the call center was more than the cost of running that call center. That's the impact it created for that organization.
Okay, great. So, but we know that although there is all this promise from big data, that there's still a lot of obstacles for companies who are trying to turn that into to information that they can use to improve their business. And so I wonder from each of you what you see as sort of the major obstacles today. Is it the data itself, the technology? Is it the people issues? What do you see from the customers that you work with? What are sort of the sticking points, Paul?
Sure. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that we have heard this vision, and now it's the question of how to make it come true. Actually, Napoleon III actually talked about this. He said the people are never more dangerous than when they have been given a vision and it has yet to arrive, and then they burn down his house. So this little period that we're in here is really, really critical. And what we see with customers is, in some cases, some degree of concern. Some degree of concern around what might be uncovered. If data about the organization were more freely available. And not in terms of anything nefarious, but just in terms of losing power, just like actual personal power. So for example, marketing campaigns in a consumer packaged goods company probably have something to say about distribution shortages, about shortages in distribution centers throughout North America. When there's a shortage at a distribution center for, let's say, barbecue chips, that means that there was a lost revenue opportunity. But the cause may be that the marketing department ran a price promotion and then just didn't tell anybody. So it would be problematic organizationally for information to be freer that way, because then that means that all the managers have to have their eyes wide open. So that is partly an issue. But I would say that there's one other big issue which I think can be more easily remedied, and that issue is people who can ask questions. And there's really people who can imagine what might be done with the data that the company has? What new combination might create a new kind of value? So for example, imagine that you get knee surgery, an MRI is done on your knee, and it's created by the radio tech, it's used by the doctor, and it seems to be specific to that procedure, to you. 2 years go by, and all of a sudden, an analyst in the hospital has a new question. What factors play the biggest role in reducing readmissions for people who get knee surgery? They need all the MRIs. They need all of the medical charts from every single knee surgery that was done. They need to know all the information about outpatient care. They need to know all the information about the rehab that was done for those people. Every single piece of data from all of those data sets was created by someone who never intended to support this analysis. This is now a secondary usage of that data. But it is the imagination to see existing data as diamonds in the rough. If only you could combine them together, into a new crown.
Sanjeev, what do you see as the largest obstacle out there?
Yeah, so one of the obstacles which we see pretty much across is the ability to look at it holistically. So if you look at big data, there's been a lot of focus around the data itself. The ability to manage data, the ability to bring down your cost points from, so many dollars per terabyte to this thing, the latency issues, et cetera, et cetera. But really, to get a business value out of it, you have to look at it holistically across the entire stack. And I'll give an example. You get your data under control, and you look at the insights which need to be generated for actions, business actions. You need a good analytical layer on top of it. Now you look at the analytical layer, the way it is designed in all organizations today, including some of the leading organizations, it's designed for working on structured data. It's, like you said, questions being asked, and then data being pumped in to answer that question, to prove, disprove, or find out a graph which fits into the prediction model or propensity scores, et cetera, et cetera. That analytical model has to move to while this is very important and will remain, it also has to move to something which is more discovery-based, which is more iterative, right? You will have answers from the data for which the questions will have to be framed, right? Both need to, so this migration has to happen. Also in the analytical layer, if you look at the analytical, the way it is very departmentalized. You have departments, you have marketing division running with their own statistic. It's fragmented. It has to become more industrialized, right? It has to be something which is more across the organization, which can provide that layer. So that's one. Visualization, there were enough discussions in the morning sessions, we'll not get into it, but it's a very key factor. The amount of data, if it has to be consumed in a usable fashion, the earlier Excel sheet and the Cognos and the conventional BI systems are not the ones. It has to be more discovery oriented. I mean, if I'm asking a question, if I want to find out why the performance of, let's say, one of my verticals did not happen, you need not only the verticals data, but also the industry data, your competitors' data, maybe the GDP of that country, maybe what's happening in that continent, et cetera. It's a multi-diverse, discovery-based visualization which is required. Last but not the least, all this will typically bring substantial value if you have a accompanying process re-engineering which is required. It's a new way of doing things, like you said, and that requires, if you really want to embed the big data, the analytics, and the visualization, you have to embed it into the processes. And that requires process re-engineering. The old process is not optimally suited for getting the maximum value out of the big data solution which you will put in place.
So this actually, what you just raised is a really big issue in our eyes, which is the interoperation of these two totally different ways of getting value out of data. This data-first approach and this model-first approach. And so the model-first approach of getting value from data is the approach that we all know and love. You build the model first in order to make the data do a specific thing for you. So maybe you're going to capture the data from an equity trade, or you are going to aggregate a customer's charges in order to send them a bill. You build a model, fill it with conforming data to make the data do something specific. The data-first approach is where you just get the data together to figure out what can it do. And these two approaches are fully complementary. It was just as you were describing. Once you have this discovery, well, okay, then what are you going to do with it? Well, then what you're going to do with it is you want to change your business processes in order to rise to the next level of best practice. That means you have to take the discovery and you have to inject it into a process that exists in the model first world. And so these two things are becoming completely intermingled. They are truly two separate ways of getting value from data. They're philosophically different, and the technologies you use to do it are different. But what we see with our customers is that they're more and more frequently being intermingled, intimately intertwined.
And I think, to pick up on that, I think a good example is the automotive industry. The amount of data they sit on that they don't really, and I'm being sort of overly categorical here for purposes of emphasis, not trying to insult anybody from the automotive industry, but they sit on a treasure trove of data that can potentially empower a whole range of new services in the connected car vision of the world. Things ranging from being able to know that when a car 5 cars ahead turns on its wipers or has to hit the brake for black ice, that data can be sent up to the cloud and sent backwards to cars that are following it as a security application. So these types of innovations that really, require rethinking what business you're in and what you're representing to the consumer, I think is another sort of obstacle or challenge for some of the, the service delivery value chain here.
So, but back to the issue of obstacles, in your own business, what did you find were the biggest obstacles for, sort of building the strongest business that you could?
I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is as you grow as a business and as you start to serve different business segments, the needs diverge a bit. And maybe the biggest divergence or way of expressing it is enterprise focus versus consumer focus. And without, again, being sort of overly categorical, and again, the automotive industry has very high quality supplier management processes, and you have a whole way of working with the auto guys. And if you design your processes around satisfying their quality, cycle time, et cetera, and then you at the same time try to take that same platform and model and apply it to a consumer market where you're competing with different platforms that approach things very differently. Consumer market tends to think of much shorter cycle times, learn by doing, and this totally runs in conflict with how the automotive industry thinks about launching a product. You have to have something tested and nailed and verified and QA'd before it'll go into production. Whereas Facebook, they experiment every day. That's how they think. And so, and you necessarily in our business need to address both, because in our world, it's all about scale of access to the largest amount of data you can get to put through the platform to build the traffic models. And so, being able to do the consumer as well as the automotive side, is really a challenge that we've figured out how to do.
Yeah. So, taking lessons learned from your own experience, how do you advise other companies to go about data discovery, turning all the bits and bytes into information that you can use?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the best way to think about it is just creating data and putting it into a platform, and just doing that I don't think is enough to add value. I think that comes from the insights. Maybe this is trite and obvious, but we found, for example, that we collect probe data from commercial fleets, from automobiles, as I mentioned earlier, and incidents. So the government, various departments of transport publish incident data whenever there's a major traffic event. A couple of weeks ago, there was a bridge that collapsed near Seattle. And it was really interesting when you look at how the different platforms that provide traffic or related mapping services reported that event. And one of the things that our platform can do is algorithmically, we don't need to wait until there's an announcement by a Department of Transport to indicate there's an event. We can just detect anomalies, in the flow of data, in the flow of probe data coming in, And that wasn't something that was initially, in our algorithm. So we've been able to do that over time. So it's really about, I think, a constant revisiting of the core assumptions and problem you're trying to solve for your customers, and really trying to develop new insights in how the data can be used. And you're not always going to be right. And I guess continuing to evolve the value proposition from the point of view of new types of data. We're now going to start launching, and we've launched in some markets, a parking service. So basically trying to do for parking what we did for traffic, make it available to consumers on a real-time, anywhere basis, finding parking spots. So it's being continually able to move and push new types of data through the system.
Did you have anything to, any advice for companies out there of how to go about
if you, one good approach that we have seen some of the companies adopt is to take a two-stream approach in the space. I mean, if you look at the need there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of anecdotal stories floating around. There's a need to show differential value quickly, right? At the same time, this is a technology which is evolving, which has a lot of nuances, and it needs a platform which is more long-termist. So you need to innovate on the quick, low-hanging fruit, the quick and dirty kind of solution. So I'll give an example. So there are certain countries in Europe where if you're taking a house on a mortgage and you let it out, you have to pay some additional interest. Your interest rates are different. And for this bank, nobody bothered to report such a thing. So very, very simple exercise. They reached out to the social side, the rental portals, etc., where renting and buying all these things happen. Got a feed from that, put in some smart algorithm to match the CRM data and the ID with the, using addresses as a reference, etc. And they were able to generate a list of people who have let out the mortgages, which is this thing. Now, it's a very interesting use case. It's quick, dirty, impactful. You go from 0 to 10 in it's something they never did before, and it clearly brings in a revenue stream. But however, the problem with the quick and dirty solutions is you have 10 of these solutions, and very quickly you'll have the well-known problem of spaghetti of solutions with different stacks and technologies, which just don't scale up at an enterprise level. So this stream is for demonstrating value to business to keep the excitement going, but on a parallel basis, you design your really long-term enterprise strategy on what stacks, what technologies, what are the process changes, a structured process of assimilating all the information, running it on pilots, defining the multiple layers which we discussed, and building a strategy which probably would take a couple of years, will sustain you across, and then you start dropping into all the quick solutions in that. So I think a balance between the two is a good approach to keep the business users excited, at the same time not fall into a trap of very fragmented kind of an approach.
Paul, what do you think is sort of next, the next challenge in the say next 2 or 3 years, once we've, I don't know, I suppose gotten a lot better at discovery, what will be the next problems?
Well, omniscience is hard, especially because once you learn some things about the business, then you discover there are all kinds of things you were not aware, you did not know. There's actually, by the way, the best piece of psychological research ever is on this topic. It's called Unskilled and Unaware of It: How One's Own Incompetence Leads to Inflated Self-Assessment. It's a true piece of psychological research. It was done at the University of Cornell. If you have not found this thing, read it. Unskilled and Unaware of It. Fabulous. But this is the problem. What they actually found is that people who had greater skill in a particular area, like forming grammatical sentences, rated their performance lower than those who cannot. The point is that when you better understand your skills, you have a more sanguine view of what you can actually do. Well, so what we're going to find is that as companies start to create new combinations of data, combinations from their own operations, from the transactional warehouse, with data from, let's say, new medical devices given to teenage diabetes patients. So now we're bringing together data about the hospital, data about the device, data about the patient's behavior at home. What we're going to find is that entirely new questions arise. that in this case might ask about, well, what happens with after-patient care? And so here now is an entirely new set of questions that require new instrumentation of new activities to create more data, to create new combinations, to come up with more questions. So, and frankly, this is not a new thing. Big data is just the latest chapter in humanity's quest to understand itself, to understand ourselves and our world. And so I suspect that what's going to happen here is that as we push back the veil of ignorance within our own companies about how inventory is related to procurement struggles, how marketing campaigns are related to distribution, we will find a greater need for more data, not a lesser one.
Well, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. If anyone has a question. Oh, one back there.
Just curious, as I'm with an organization that's just getting into using big data, and I would love your insights on pitfalls to avoid. And just to give you some context, this is at the scale of we have 1.5 FTE kind of allocated to this. We're not a big company, and we're trying to mine maybe a couple million data points or something like that. We don't have massive amounts of data. But what are some of the, from a strategic or structural standpoint, some of the things that a lot of companies do wrong early on that we should be looking out for?
I'd like to take that.
So, the first advice or the first pitfall is not to look at it as a technology issue. It is, so the initial phases of building awareness and the pilots should be focused more from a, or equally from a business perspective as much as a technology perspective. So I would, so if you were to look at five key initiatives within your organization or 5 key processes, and within that, what are the kind of KPIs which really impact from a business perspective, and try to vertically slice down what would be required from a big data perspective. So rather than boiling the ocean, you look at, for this business process, these are the KPIs which can be optimized and which matter, which can have an impact. For these are the kind of analytical solutions or analytical requirements which need to be put in place. Evaluate whether you have it or not, or what is required to build that in. And for those kind of analysis, what are the kind of data which is currently there, not there, which can be augmented, which can be brought in from the external world or from the unstructured data sources you have. And then look at it, in a very integrated fashion. Especially if you're starting on small scale, I would say that is the one which would create impact, rather than try to build a platform for big data and a platform for analytics, which could be fairly heavy duty. And at the end of it, somebody may say that this is all you generated out of all the efforts.
Anyone have anything to add?
Yes, I'm actually going to give you completely different advice. just to be difficult, it's a completely different approach. So one of the pitfalls is thinking that you know what you're looking for. At the other end of the spectrum, one of the other pitfalls is thinking that you don't need a hypothesis. Both of these things are untrue. But the point of a hypothesis is that it might turn out to be true and it might turn out to be false. So this is the trick, is that you have to come up with a problem that somebody in the business cares about. They genuinely believe that if you learn something new, they will make money or cut costs or take greater wallet share or be taller, thinner, younger, something. But the problem is that you have to be open to the possibility that you might come back to them and say, I have good news. I have proven that your hypothesis is wrong. So you have to think through what are the political implications here, because you want to avoid framing the problem so neatly that no one really cares what the answer is because they think they know what it is already. But you also want to prepare your constituents that disproving the hypothesis may itself be valuable.
Paul, do you have any pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of riff on that a little bit, I think it's sound advice. And when you're thinking about building a business, and maybe that's not exactly the problem set you have, but understand what problem you're trying to solve with a hypothesis. And maybe I could borrow from sort of the early history of INRIX, which I just learned about, and I find it very interesting. The company really started, the first product, that this was 7 or 8 years ago, was a piece of hardware that basically brought together traffic information that was available from public sources. There was no sort of aggregating of disparate types of data from commercial fleets and what have you. And during the process of trying to raise money from venture capitalists, the founder of the company was given the suggestion, hey, you really ought to think about what problem you're trying to solve, and maybe there are other sources of data that you could get access to, and thus became this idea of crowdsourcing the data. So, if don't be so focused on the product you have today. Think really about the problem you're trying to solve, because there's probably a lot of different ways of solving that problem beyond the implementation you have.
Do we have any other questions? We need the mic for you. If anyone else has a question, maybe raise your hand so our mic holder will know where to go next. We have a gentleman over here.
So I thought that was a really interesting comment to start thinking about the problem you're looking to solve. So I lead the analytics team for a mid-sized retail company, and we have a ton of data, and we get a ton of questions. But they're all kind of these microscopic, like they're not going to change the way we do business. And the question, the huge question is, how do we drive more sales? So how do I get people to start thinking about problems that are, beyond the sales and beyond just the measure the widgets?
Sure.
So that's a good question and tough one. So you're absolutely right. There are two ways. The analytics have been, especially in industries where analytics has been in use, like retail or banking or telecom, the initial focus is a lot on what I would call scale up. You do a customer segmentation, you do a pricing, you do a merchandising solution, you do a customer churn analytics, etc. The idea is, how can these technologies be leveraged to improve what you are doing? And that normally is a tough ask, because you have already invested a fair amount. It is like you are already there and you want to take it there. The scaling out part of it is something that has to be orchestrated, and nothing is more effective than creating an initial win. And I'll give you an example from a retail industry itself, where this is an organization which again has huge amount of data, and they're doing a lot of big data analytics to improve their customer segmentation, pricing, online pricing, dynamic pricing, etc. But something which caught on a lot of interest, like you said, thinking differently, scaling out, was an exercise where they combined two channels, an online and an offline channel, where if as a person I place an order on the online channel for, let's say, an iPad, right? And I intend to pick it up when I drive back home. There's a 4-hour window in which you can do some kind of a cross-sell, upsell. And what they did was kind of immediately profile the person, and if they identified I'm an IT service guy into a lot of customer presentation, they would give me let's say a connector to a projector, an add-on item which is relevant to my job at a 25% discount. More often than not, the person will end up buying it when he's collecting the laptop. So the excitement can be built up if on an you create small user groups. You definitely have people who are interested in innovating or finding out innovative use cases which are, like you said, relevant to the business, but it's likely what nobody has thought of. I think 2 or 3 such stories really have a catch-on effect. And that's probably one way to kind of energize the whole system in finding out these kind of use cases.
Yeah, I think if the struggle is around sparking the imagination for the questions. Sometimes you might flip it around, and instead of saying, "Hey, let's see if we can think of better questions," instead flip it around and say, "Hey, let's try an experiment. Let's something like Sanjeev has described. Let's what do you think? increases sales, and the sales manager says, oh well, I think more contact from sales reps increases sales, or the marketing manager says, oh, I think more marketing campaigns increases sales. Okay, great, let's try it. And this practice of building up this habit of experimentation, and then believing that the data that comes from that experimentation not only will resolve your experiment, but would also lead you to the next one, is really the habit that Amazon built up in the beginning. They initially hired a whole bunch of people to write reviews of books. And there's human beings writing about books. Oh, I loved, Oh, Cry the Beloved Country, and this is why. And they then had a question. Well, is this really driving sales? Do reviews really increase sales? And do they increase sales more than just showing books to people which were purchased by other people who just happened to buy the book that they bought? No one knew, and so they tried it. The rest is history. I mean, the recommendations was such a hands-down winner over the impact of reviews on increased sales, and the cost of developing those recommendations is so much lower that there's just no contest. But the point is that this started to develop a habit of testing things to see how they turn out, believing that will then lead to new ideas about what you might test next.
Thank you. So a couple of years ago, we were talking about intellectual property being, an important asset and some kind of crown jewel. We can see where it is today. So if we talk now about information or about big data, what would be your recommendation or your perspective in terms of how to address that, not from a technological standpoint, but more from a strategic standpoint, to build a differentiating factor or a barrier to entry or anything, that would today protect the future? And maybe this is, what your perspective or what you are willing to share, but would be very interesting in understanding that from your side.
Sure. I'd like to take that.
Yeah, so I would say there's quite a change happening on that intellectual property. How much of data is your differentiating intellectual property? So if you look at it for many industries, there is actually more information about your product, about your customers, beyond your firewall out there in the open than probably you have it within your CRM systems, right? So the question is moving not so much on how much data you have, but more to how fast can you get insights, or can you get insights or actions based on all the data that is available across the industry or across the networks. It is about how fast, how quickly, and how precise, accurately you can harness all this data to get some actionable insight. It is not so much of how much data you own, because there's more data outside, which if you look at the consumer industry, that's absolutely true. If you look at the example in the manufacturing world where all the machines start generating data, it's all over the place. Your automobiles, your telematic systems, even the household systems like fridge, TV, set-top boxes, they all generate data, right? The ability to aggregate it probably gives you much more business value than just leveraging your internal data. So collaborations will come into place. People will start sharing data. A retailer will start sharing data with an insurance company where both can benefit in terms of behavioral habits and getting much more targeted products to their customers.
Okay, so
I don't have anything to add.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think that's right. I think the world of data interchange and working with data sets from across the barrier of the firm, I think, is the world we live in, and focus on innovating at the algorithm level, make proprietary algorithms.
Yeah, so we give people 3 pieces of advice, which are kind of a counterpoint to at least one of the points that you described. Those three pieces of advice are, first, think in terms of data market share. Now, what that means is that there is a set of activities that your company conducts with customers and your rivals are trying to conduct them too. So this could be, actual purchase transactions, it could be service interactions, but think in terms of the activities that are producing data about your interactions with customers, especially. Could also be, interactions with suppliers, and it can also be interactions with that other players in your, overall value system have with customers. The point is that just like you would look at a market of customers, how many customers are out there, and we want to get, we want as many of them as possible to buy from us. Think in terms of there are a number of interactions out there that produce this data exhaust, and we want access to as much of that as possible. Now, some of that is going to come from getting access to data that other people create. You're going to have to buy it. Some of it is going to come from, some of it you may have to negotiate contracts to get, but some of it you may realize that you can put some kind of instrumentation in there, whether it's an online application, a mobile app, or whether it is putting sensors out there that let you capture data for your own use from those activities that your rivals don't have. So that's the first one. Think in terms of data market share. The second one is create proprietary data assets. This is extremely important in a world where, as Sanjeev has described, there is more data about your company, your customers, and your products outside your four walls than in. Because that means that your competitors have access to it just the way that you do. That's a problem. So the second issue here is to create proprietary data assets. One way to do that is, as we talked about it already, instrument activities with your own apps or other or sensors. Another way to do it is to take third-party data and put it and make a new combination that only you have. So if you bring in third-party data about, about national GDP, as Sanjeev mentioned, or maybe it's, equity trades or something like that from an exchange, but you combine that with your own transactional data or your own customer CRM data, it's like pouring milk into a cup of coffee. The whole thing becomes a different drink. That whole asset, that whole combination now becomes proprietary to you. The third piece of advice that we give is use data to make data. And this is a page straight out of Google's playbook, Amazon, eBay, LinkedIn. All of these online companies have realized that when they take data that they garner about their customer interactions and pipe that back into the way they interact with their customers, they improve the service. This is what Google does with all of our search results. They capture the data on the link that we click on for a particular search term, and then use that data to inform what results are presented to the next user, improving the quality of the service. So this same thing can apply in offline businesses as well, that you use these proprietary data assets you create to inform services you offer, capturing then data that, again, your rivals don't have. And it's possible to get a network effect type advantage from that, a competitive advantage that is exceptionally difficult to catch.
And one more dimension on which we can look at this problem is, at the end of the day, it is not data which is really the asset. It is insights which is the asset. And historically, we have spent so much of time in modeling data, creating data warehouses, et cetera, et cetera. Actually speaking, what really will differentiate is if you can create a model of insights on top of the data. And there are some organizations which are trying to define what an insight is, right? You call it signals, you call it business events, different terminologies out there. But an example of an insight is, for example, from a banking scenario, somebody withdrawing twice the amount or thrice the amount of average withdrawals over the last 6 months. It's an insight. It's built over data. It's not the data of how much ATM withdrawals, but it is what you define as a signal. So for each business process, you can define business events which are events which the system will generate and applications can subscribe to it. In a telecom scenario, 2 call drops or 3 call drops within 5 minutes is an insight, right, on which you need to act. Today, nobody models those insights, right? There is no, if you were to define an insight, If you were to ask to define a customer or a data on a customer, very easy. Customer has these attributes, these fields, etc. What is an insight? You don't have it. Can you define a schematic definition of all your insights, right? And put that layer on top of it. And you don't have to replicate these efforts or these kind of, so the system will automatically sense signals to anybody who wants to subscribe it. So that new layer will come in, and that's what would be the IP rather than the data itself. The asset would be how strong, how comprehensive is your set of insights which you have proactively defined.
Paul, what is your most valuable intellectual property, do you think?
Well, I think the core algorithms for modeling the traffic, there's special sauce there. But I think I agree with what you guys are saying is the value going forward in the business that we're in is not going to be just incrementally improving the quality of traffic data. It's going to be about bringing in new data sets. Some we source ourselves, some we license from others, some combination, and running them through our platform and building integrated data services. So as I was mentioning, parking aware routing, parking and traffic aware routing. If you're running an EV, if you have an electric vehicle, being able to get and reserve and find where all the EV charging stations are. And so building all these different types of data into an integrated solution. Right. And I don't know that that'll be protectable necessarily. It's moving quick and adding new data.
Yeah. We have time for at least one or two more questions. So, anyone out here? Okay, great.
Thank you. And I guess maybe following or asking a little deeper into that, as we talk about this potential of leveraging and merging data sources, I guess where I'm trying to fully wrap my head around, it seems like there's two very different utilizations. One being, I guess, in analytical, gathering the data and understanding your customers and their demographics and what their needs might be. But is the ultimate goal here a predictive, or is the other side a predictive model that gets further to, I guess I see a blurring of the lines between knowing your customers and then combining your customers' data or your relationship data with others, and then is the other side of that developing a predictive model for a unknown customer. If they do X, they're likely to do Y. Is that where you're looking to go, or where you see that going into an actual predictive of future behavior based on actions taken?
Yeah, both of those things are true. I mean, this is one of the crazy things about information, is that it is a so-called non-rivalrous good. That once you use it, you can use it again. You know? And so you can actually use information about an individual customer to raise the level of service that you provide to them the next time. And that piece of data can also be part of a correlation analysis that helps a website to make a best guess about what to do for a customer that just showed up. So the two things that you described, they are in fact two different things. But yes, both of those things are potentials for getting value out of data.
Predictions? How are you using data for predictions?
Yeah, so you're right. I agree with you. The use cases would be both. So if you look at some of the large telecom companies, especially in the emerging markets, over 90% of their subscribers are one-time users. You can buy a SIM card as you get off the airport without even telling your name and use it. Right? These are prepaid cards, right? And this specific service provider has over 100 billion subscribers. So it's big, and imagine 90% of them, you don't even know their names. Customer churn is the biggest problem because they're losing market share, right? So the example which you gave where you don't even know your customer, but you're trying to do something, you're trying to create a next best offer to a person whose personality you don't know, right? Whose demographics you don't know. Now, that's a very relevant use case. The way you approach it is very different. It's more of the learning, the machine learning, which you have to do on streams of data which is coming in, right? The person has logged into a network, has made 2 calls to India, so he's probably from India. You have to learn on the go and then respond back. And the second one is obvious, where you have the customer profile. You're trying to match the social data of that customer and from various different sources and trying to give a better service.
Yeah, I think
both are
sorry.
existing.
Yeah, and in our business, you know, a good example is back to what I mentioned earlier about the paradigm of navigation started with needing to tell the system, I'm here and I want to go here, and it gives you a recommendation. And the systems are getting much more sophisticated, and through machine learning, we'll be able to know what your travel habits are, what your normal commutes are. And without the system, without you telling the system, hey, I'm going to drive home today, it'll know that it's 5 o'clock, and oh boy, there's a traffic event. We need to push that to you and recommend that you leave your meeting early or reschedule a meeting or tell your wife because you're going to be late for the kids' soccer game. These things are already in development, and exactly what the panel here was saying around drawing more insights around from social platforms, being able to deliver services. For example, hey, maybe you ought to think about going to this place to pick up pizza on the way home because, boy, a bunch of your friends were there today, and there's a special. You know, so these types of insights are not far from being deployed in real systems.
Okay, I think just one last question. We'll have to be very quick in our answers. There's a woman in the front here who'd like to ask a last question. Yeah, I would. I don't even see the microphone person. Oh, there. Time's just about up, so.
Thanks so much. I think that, you know, we're talking about a lot of things that are quite cutting edge. And one thing that comes to mind and that I've been thinking about is how corporate social responsibility plays into big data. You mentioned mobile network operators, and we, within the last year, saw Orange donate an anonymized data set from the Ivory Coast for the purposes of the development community, primarily to innovate and see what they could test, what hypotheses they could find. And when you think about location-based data, traffic, disaster scenarios, you can imagine that there could be a moment when the consumer market en masse demands some kind of corporate social responsibility. So how are you starting to anticipate and think about that coming moment?
Well, you know, in our business, as I'm starting to learn, there are, for example, emergency responder services across the country and the world are actually using our data to plan disaster recovery routes for vehicles. And so just the involvement of having a government-facing business channel and a platform that's flexible to enable different types of analytics to be run on it, allows us to be in that conversation. But we definitely see those types of initiatives starting.
I would say it's a combination of two things. One, there are regulations which are effective in terms of how you can use the data commercially outside the organization. So if you're a service provider and you have all the websites you collected, how much you can use it for your internal use and how much you can share. But the challenges are, you know, you anonymize at a very high generic level, then it is fairly useless, right? You anonymize it at a smaller, you know, at the level of a block, then, you know, so smart algorithms can triangulate and zero in further. Right? So it's slightly difficult from a legal perspective to be absolutely have a system which is fail-safe. I think a lot of organizations are looking at trying their own ethical rules as to what is the line they will not cross. And we have all seen examples of where, you know, these kind of analytics with very good intentions have kind of backfired because it's felt like someone has intruded into the privacy, you know, more than what they should have. So it's a combination of legal systems which will not allow you to do certain things, right? But much beyond that is large organizations which value their brand, which value what the customers perceive, will draw their own internal policies as to how much is the transparency they will have, what are the kind of analytics which they can do but will not do, and more importantly, how they will roll out, how they will communicate to the customers as to how they are actually leveraging the data for which they have opted in.
Okay. Well, I think we'll have to end it here, but I want to thank you all for coming. It was a really interesting conversation, and I think we have another session in the main stage, so that's your next stop. Thank you.